So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this last seminar of the year. And in this one in particular, I'm very happy to announce that my dear friend Walter accepted to talk to us about his latest book. I think it's your third book already, right?
Yeah.
Very good. And Walter is going to talk to us today about Photoshop fantasies. And it's a very nice discussion in the technical part and also in the implications of these fantasies, sometimes with political implications, sometimes with personal implications. And it's very nice to have Walter here today. Walter and I have a long history together. We are very good friends. We did part of our PhDs together. His PhD advisor was also my co-advisor in my PhD many, many years ago in 2008. And it's very, very good to have you here today, Walter. For those of you who don't know Professor Walter Scheirer, he has been a professor. He has been a professor with the Notre Dame University in South Bend, Indiana, US. And he's interested mainly in problems of recognition, pattern recognition, including the representations and algorithms supporting solutions for pattern recognition. Along with me and Professor Terence Boat, we proposed many years ago some initial steps for open set recognition, and Walter has many other interesting work since then. And one of these areas of interest is in forensics, and this is basically what he's going to talk to us today. We've been partners for some forensics projects in the last years, and these give us some different vantage points to discuss with you. For those of you who don't know, this seminar is part of a partnership between the University of Campinas and the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, PUC-Rio, in a program called ConexãoRioCampinas or Rio Campinas Connection. So without further ado, I thank you once again, Walter, for accepting the invitation. The stage is yours. Typically, we have 45, 50 minutes and then some time for questions. All right? Thanks a lot, and I'll be in the background.
All right. Thank you so much, Anderson, for that excellent introduction. I'm really happy to be with all of you today talking about some stuff that comes out of my recent book called A History of Fake Things on the Internet. It just came out this month on Stanford University Press, and this talk is adapted from one of the chapters that looks into the history of photographic manipulation. And I think this is a topic all of you are really interested in from the technical side of things. So I think it'll be really interesting to dive into the history because as I found researching this book, in many cases, we're making some assumptions about the media that we're analyzing using forensic algorithms without thinking deeply about the social context, about the history of the form of manipulation, how it's supposed to be received by an audience, all these really interesting things that are a big piece to this entire puzzle, right? Which of course is in the news. So I'll start by asking this question: why is there so much fake stuff on the internet? That there is fake stuff on the internet should be surprise to nobody at this point. But of course, right, it's definitely a prevalent thing, right? And again, many of you are forensics researchers, you know, right, there's a really salient question that affects society, right, behind the scenes. That said, as I pointed out in my little preamble to this talk, this is a really complex issue, right? It really requires us to think deeply about this content that we find on the internet. Right here in the United States, of course, we have a highly polarized political situation at the moment. We have what is shaping up to be a rematch between former President Donald Trump and the current president, Joe Biden, in this upcoming election in 2024, just next year, right around the corner. And associated, right, with this heated political moment has been all sorts of stuff related to content on the internet. For instance, conspiracy movements like QAnon, which have been fueled by all sorts of elaborate writing on the internet about politics and the supernatural and all these interesting things that get people pretty excited. And it's been alleged that this is creating some sort of tension, right, within certain political communities and leading some people down a path of violence. For instance, right, this QAnon movement has been linked to the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. We have concerns related to public health. For instance, the anti-vaccine movement is largely propelled by content on the internet these days, specifically memes, humorous media bits, right? Images, videos that kind of get people to think critically about a certain public health matter in the wrong way in many cases, right? And that leads again to action in the physical world, right? So you're sort of getting exposed to these ideas in a virtual space, usually social media, and then some people sort of exit and move on to the real world where they're trying to impact, right, things in a way that is not always in their best interest. Now, again, looking at this as sort of an historian of technology, when I was writing this book, I was really interested in the form this content took. And what I would find time and time again is that the disinformation, right, the edited images, they were almost always in meme form. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people, especially, right, the media forensics community, right? And we're going to talk about, you know, some of the preconceived notions that forensics has in this talk. But again, we're always thinking kind of like the perfect fake, the near perfect fake. But the content that people seem to like sharing that's manipulated is almost always in like an obviously manipulated form, like these memes, for instance. Donald Trump editing images, recirculating stuff through retweets when he was president that was edited by other people. These kind of cheap fake like images, like this fake image of Joe Biden allegedly hiding alone in his basement during COVID. Celebrities wearing Trump paraphernalia, right? This is another edited image. This is kind of what we see. And again, it's not that, oh, like, you know, these are really clever, good manipulations, but the message they send is pretty strong. So how much fake stuff is out there on the internet? Well, New York Magazine tried to dig into this a few years ago and found that less than 60% of all web traffic is human. The bulk of users on social media platforms are bots, and the veracity of most of the content people are consuming is in question. The internet, as we're told, and as we see on a regular basis, is awash in all of these different fictions. The primary concern that we hear about these days is deep fakes. This, of course, I think we're all familiar with, but just in case anybody out there has never heard of this concept, this is kind of synthetic and edited video using generative models. So you can take an existing video for perhaps, right, like this example, a video of the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and you reanimate it such that it's sort of like a plausible or semi-plausible delivery of a speech, right, that never took place. For instance, this is an example from the beginning of the most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It appeared to depict Zelensky capitulating, basically giving up in this conflict, telling his armed forces to put down their weapons because there was no hope in the face of this Russian onslaught. Now, of course, this was a deepfake video. That message never came out of the lips of the Ukrainian president. And what's really interesting, this is kind of like the doomsday scenario we've heard about a lot with deepfakes. This could have perhaps altered the course of the war, but nothing really happened. There was no political fallout. The armed forces of Ukraine stayed in their trenches and continued to fight. And that I think is really interesting. And that's kind of the question we want to dig into in this talk. Why doesn't such material really work, right? No one really believed this. It was automatically like discredited as soon as it hit the internet, right? Nobody really was paying attention to it, though, again, the mainstream media reported on it, but of course they knew it was fake as well. And so that's really interesting. And that's something that you see time and time again when it comes to the effectiveness of such fakes on the internet. What does seem to be working, though, which I just pointed out a few minutes ago, these meme universes. You're seeing like really complicated storytelling taking place visually with obviously manipulated content. For instance, at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, You had memes like this bat soup meme circulating on the internet. If any of you sort of remember that early period, there was a lot of uncertainty about the pandemic. Where did it start? How did somebody come in contact with this virus? And there was this story circulating that somebody sat down at a restaurant in China and they ate a steaming bowl of bat soup. Now we know that bats do harbor different coronaviruses, and they are a suspected cause of the pandemic. But when I dug into this, because it seemed a little bit suspicious, I dug into this story in the early days of the pandemic, and I found out that this was not true at all. Bat soup is not a dish that is served in China. And again, I was sort of skeptical because I've been to China. No one ever served me a steaming bowl of bat soup. But these memes were circulating quite widely, and it became this urban legend that many people were believing, right? And people were sort of, matter-of-factly here in the United States, like talking about, oh, the pandemic started because someone in China ate some bat soup. And then looking at these memes, they were a little bit suspicious, right? If you sort of like scrutinize the bat's face here, it may look familiar if you're familiar with memes. That's actually a Pepe the Frog meme, right? So he's got the smirk of Pepe, right? The head shape is the same. And of course, famously, Pepe the Frog has been associated with far-right politics in the United States, though. A lot of that is sort of parody and satire material, and there's been a sort of large movement to liberate Pepe from the paranoid fringe. That said, again, this content really resonates, and it's sort of easier to slip in a dangerous message through a meme than it is a really plausible-looking deep fake. And so that's what we've seen time and time again. And I call this general idea restyling reality. So, you can take real content from the physical world, for instance, right, like a selfie, and you can start to do things like apply augmented reality filters, right, all sorts of interesting creative facial filters, and then share this kind of content with your friends. And many people these days are living so much of their lives virtually that this becomes the norm. In fact, recent research from my lab has shown that a lot of people are starting to sort of, understand this type of content as being real in some sense, right? Which is interesting. And then there are other ways you can do this, right? You can make, again, like political commentary using meme restyling techniques. For instance, coming back to the war in Ukraine, this is the soldier from the Donbass region. And he has been memeified with this Wojak meme, right? So this is kind of saying, like this conflict is dismal, right? There's a lot of despair here. If you're familiar with the stock meme character Wojak, he symbolizes melancholy, right? So this feels bad, man. We're in this war. And again, this is the type of content that is quite representative of image editing. So again, because so much of this has been tied to politics, so much of it has been tied to violent actions in the real world, surely we should just ban all of this stuff, right? Is that the right course of action? I don't think so. In fact, I think we really need a deep reflection on the history of photography itself to understand what's going on here. I'm also going to point out in the rest of this talk some fundamental misunderstandings about the role of the internet in society, which I think has been sort of driving a lot of these conversations. But first, let's start with a very brief history of photographic propaganda and how it works, right? Because we hear this invoked quite a bit when commentators are talking about the more modern instantiations of photographic manipulation on the internet. And to do so, let's start with a quote from Mao Zedong, right? The famed Chinese leader, right? Revolutionary China in the 20th century. And somebody who was actually quite media savvy. He really understood the media and especially the role of visual media really well. He had this to say in his essay on practice. If you want knowledge, you must take part in the practice of changing reality. And in fact, this is something that the Chinese censors within the communist government were quite good at and are still quite good at to this day. But Mao, it turns out, isn't advocating for revising history in some plausible way. He's really interested in changing information such that it has an immediate sort of effect on one's behavior right now. And here's a really good example from China that I think portrays this concept really well. On the top is an edited photo of Mao's own funeral. And you can see there's some gaps in the lineup. And you can see at the bottom panel here is the original image, right? So some people have been deleted from this image. Now, that's a very common technique in many authoritarian governments, right? You can probably think of some famous examples from the Soviet Union, from the Third Reich, right, going back in history. Now, what's really interesting here, the common interpretation is that we are just meant to believe that this is how things happened, right? Like this was the actual funeral, and this is how everybody lined up. But this image is really suspicious when you start to like look at everybody else in the photo, right? There's a really tight lineup of this massive crowd in Tiananmen Square, right behind the leadership that is standing out in front. There are these conspicuous gaps, right? And of course, there's some key people missing. In fact, the 4 people were deleted from this image, and they're known as the Gang of Four. They included very senior Chinese politicians who had been associated with the Cultural Revolution, especially its excesses, and who were immediately arrested following the death of Mao, right? Because they were going to be brought to justice. One of these people included Mao's own wife. Now, of course, if you were living in China, you would notice right away that, here are the usual suspects lining up, but there are 4 key people missing. And of course, this was widely publicized that they had been purged from the government. And of course, Mao's own wife missing from the scene would also be a rather suspicious, right, occurrence. And so what folks are supposed to get out of viewing this edited image is that the government is very powerful, it is in control, and can erase people at will if they mess up. Right. So this is sending a very clear signal that these people were deleted intentionally. This was not meant to be a revision of history. It was meant to be an explicit message about the capabilities of the government and the stability of the government, right, following Mao's death. That said, Western analysts have routinely misunderstood the purpose of this type of image editing. For instance, there's this really interesting book called Making People Disappear, which is a catalog of many different instances of these types of photos from the Third Reich, from Maoist China, from the Soviet Union, from other authoritarian governments and dictatorships during the Cold War. And there's a really interesting preface to this book written by the US national security figure Roy Godson. He has this to say. And he's talking about the author of this book, the photographer Alain Joubert, who is French. Joubert points out that the systematic faking or falsification of history are encountered anywhere a serious effort is made to copy the methods of totalitarian propaganda, characterized by its 3 major styles: fascist, Nazi, and communist. The falsification of photographs comes easily to those governments and elites that seek to be the sole interpreters of history and have a monopoly on the information media. Right. So Godson is promoting, again, this very sort of, prevalent idea here in the West that we are meant to believe this is how history unfolded when we look at the edited images. But that, of course, is not the case. And this idea perpetuates. And of course, it works its way into popular entertainment. We can turn, for instance, to Michael Crichton's 1992 crime thriller, Rising Sun, which has a really interesting court scene in which investigators are sort of talking about the future of evidence, especially photographic evidence. Now, Crichton's writing this in 1992, and of course, he's a very astute observer of changes in technology. Or he's very famous for writing novels like Jurassic Park, which anticipate the unintended consequences of technology. This is kind of like a minor bit, when we think about, Crichton's writing, but it's really important, I think, for understanding how this idea became so widespread. So one of the characters, again, talking about this new invention of the digital camera, has this to say: the case law isn't entirely clear, but it's coming. All photographs are suspect these days because now with digital systems, they can be changed perfectly. And this is an idea, again, we hear today, right? That, what do we do if we have digital evidence in court? Everything can be faked so perfectly. But of course, if you think about a court case, it's probably not the case, right? Because there's going to be a lot of different evidence, right? Some of it physical. There's going to be lots of witness testimony. Usually these cases don't come down to one single piece of evidence. Which brings us then to a bigger question. What is the truth? About 15 years ago, the documentary filmmaker Errol Morris wrote a series of essays, which he published in the New York Times, about this very question related to photography. And he was really skeptical of this idea that, again, the photograph is this perfect objective representation of history, and it would be very easy to fool people by changing things in these photographs. So he makes this claim. The idea that photographs hand us an objective piece of reality, that they by themselves provide us with the truth, is an idea that has been with us since the beginnings of photography. But photographs are neither true nor false in and of themselves. They are only true or false with respect to statements that we make about them or the questions that we might ask of them. So what Morris is saying here is that a photograph is actually a social object. You can interrogate it. There can be different modes of interpretation. There are going to be different observers getting different things out of these photographs. There can be multiple messages encoded into a photograph, and this reception of the photograph can evolve over time. That makes it really, really complicated, right, to understand this, but that's the way it's meant to be. In fact, he's kind of excited about this, right, because it makes the photographs in some sense more interesting. But that's kind of alarming when you think about it, because it's like, okay, but like, what is evidence? What is actually true? How do we figure this out? Surely some things are true. And I'd say, yes, of course, that is an important observation. And of course, philosophers have been thinking about this for a long time. So writing in the 20th century, trying to understand the actions of authoritarian governments, the philosopher Hannah Arendt basically had this to say about the truth in terms of what it is. Conceptually, we may call the truth what we cannot change. Metaphorically, it is the ground on which we stand and the sky that stretches above us. So what Arendt is trying to tell us is that don't worry so much about individual pieces of evidence, right? What is the consensus view on topics? That's what's really important, right? If there is a consensus that, something occurs on a regular basis, right, and it's generally acknowledged to be true, then it probably is true. This is why deep fakes don't really work, right? Because it really is just a media object in isolation. And especially because most of the ones we hear about are so sensational, you can step back and kind of think, hold on a second. If this were true, I would have heard about it already, right? Nobody I know is talking about it. It's not in the news, except that in case the reporters have already reported that it's a deep fake. It's very, very easy to debunk, right? Because there's so much evidence to the contrary, especially when you think about the actions and statements of public figures. These are people with public schedules. These are people that are being followed by reporters on a continual basis. These are people that are interacting with many other people whom they trust, right, and who are trustworthy. It's really, really difficult, if not impossible, for a lot of this sort of perfect fakery to ever have any real impact. And of course, that's what these authoritarian governments realized in the 20th century. And that's why they chose to intentionally manipulate their images such that they would send an obvious message, right? The changes would be noted, right? And they would send a message that had nothing to do with revising history. It was really a comment on the present. So that takes us to the very act of manipulating photographs. I think what is amazingly underappreciated and what is mind-blowing when you go back in time, the fact that in a dark room, you had access to a lot of really interesting special effects so advanced in some cases, you would almost imagine that you needed Photoshop to pull them off, right? Or some advanced generative model to pull them off today. But photographic manipulation was very, very common in the 19th century. In fact, surprisingly, as soon as the camera is invented, people are faking photos. In fact, the first fake photograph, which you can see here, Self-Portrait as a Drowned Man, was produced by one of the inventors of an early camera process. Yes, I kid you not. In fact, this is him posing as a corpse. And this photo has a really interesting backstory. It was accompanied by this silly story, which the photographer himself, whose name was Hippolyte Bayard, he wrote this. And this fake photograph was meant to be a protest image. And I'll explain in a second, but let me read you this real quick. The corpse which you see here is that of Monsieur Bayard, inventor of the process that you have just seen, or the marvelous results of which you are soon going to see. To my knowledge, this ingenious and indefatigable researcher has been working for about 3 years to perfect his invention. The Academy, the King, and all those who have seen his pictures that he himself found imperfect have admired them as you do at this moment. This has brought him much honor, but has not yielded him a single farthing. The government, having given too much to Monsieur Daguerre, said it could do nothing for Monsieur Bayard, and the unhappy man drowned himself. Oh, the fickleness of human affairs. Artists, scholars, journalists were occupied with him for a long time. But here he has been at the morgue for several days, and no one has recognized or claimed him. Ladies and gentlemen, you'd better pass along for fear of offending your sense of smell, for as you can observe, the face and hands of the gentleman are beginning to decay. This is a very over-the-top complaint. So as it turns out, Bayard's process was not as popular as Daguerre's process, which of course was the famous daguerreotype, right? Perhaps the most prevalent form of early photography in the 19th century. He alleged that the French government was backing Daguerre, not backing him, and he was really mad about this state of affairs. And so he writes, again, this extremely over-the-top protest message, which he circulated with the fake photograph. This is something, again, that's very akin to like 4chan green text stories on the internet today, right? Where you have like a really extreme, in many cases, like obviously fake, like image or cartoon, some kind of meme associated with, right, a story just like this. And these things are interesting, right? Because again, there's a social history to this. There's a really interesting technical history related to the camera embedded in all of this. And this is kind of how it all starts. And it just goes on from there. Very quickly, darkroom technicians recognized that it's not that difficult to retouch photographs. So this is, again, film photography. So the way this works is you have a camera, which when the shutter is open, exposes some chemicals on film to light, and that's what generates the image. Taking that negative that is produced, right, that exposed film to a dark room, you can do some interesting things to it. If you're familiar with film photography, you know it's an inverse process. So whatever is light on the negative is actually dark in the photograph and vice versa. So to retouch photographs, you could start by adding ink in different places, right? That would lighten up the image. Or you could scrape, right, some of the darker areas to lighten them up, right, which would lighten up, the resulting photograph. Which would darken up the resulting photograph, right? All of that was possible. And things were invented like this retouching desk where you could mount the negative and do all of this. And in the 19th century, it became common to basically order these effects when you sat for a portrait, like a professional portrait. Here's an example, right, of a young woman who was not happy with her complexion. So just like today, where we would add a facial filter, usually like a low pass filter, to smooth out the face, the retouching desk would be used, right, to clean up the complexion, right? Then the person would be very happy. That was just in a catalog of things, right? Just again, like you could dial this up in Photoshop or in any of your favorite social media apps these days. This was also used for political purposes, which I think is really interesting. Here you have one of the mutineers from the famous incident in the Russian Revolution, the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. The Soviet censors were not happy with this man's complexion because he had very ethnic-looking features. He was Ukrainian, and so they lightened him up. They smoothed out this sort of like pockmarks on his face and made him look more European. Because there were a bunch of, right, the senior Soviet leadership at the time, this textbook image was produced, right, were of European extraction. And of course, you see this today with all sorts of different apps that can change your ethnicity on the fly. Cropping, this one's pretty simple, right, as an operation, but can have really dramatic effects on the interpretation of an image. Coming back to Mao, here he is in the middle of a leadership group reviewing these military personnel on an airfield. At a certain point in Chinese history, the censors decided Mao should always be in the front of any image, right? He should never be following anybody. And so again, you can sort of increase his prestige and his honor by clipping out various people. Face swapping becomes quite common, often to hilarious effect. This is one of the most famous fake photographs of the film era in the United States anyway. This is the gold medal winning US 1960 Miracle on Ice hockey team, which, squared off against the Soviet Union in this Olympics, got Olympic glory. What happened here during the team photograph, some of the key players were absent. And of course, right, when you wanted to like produce, the final photograph, commemorating this great event, you wanted those key players in the photo. So what somebody did was hilariously find some other photographs cut out the heads, and then paste them into this photo. And you can see the lighting is badly mismatched. The size of the heads is wrong. You can clearly see, just looking at the slide, whose head was replaced. And you kind of wonder what the players felt, the people who had their faces replaced by these heads, what they were thinking. We have more sophisticated ways to do this, right? This is kind of like, a precursor to the idea of a deep fake. Props were very common and widely deployed. Really fascinating, famous examples of this on this slide. For instance, Walt Whitman. This is a photograph that accompanied some early editions of his poetry collection, Leaves of Grass. Whitman was kind of a proto-influencer, very, very ahead of his time on being media savvy. He cultivated this persona of being very much in tune with nature, so much so that animals and insects would sort of like just gravitate towards him, right? And here it looks like he's interacting with this butterfly that has landed on his finger, but it's just a prop. In fact, if you look closely, you can see the wire that the prop is attached to his finger with. Next to this is a very famous photo from a famous sequence of photos called the Cottingley Fairies. There were two cousins in the English countryside in the early 20th century that staged a bunch of photos using cardboard cutouts of fairies. And this launched a huge controversy in England over the question of whether or not fairies existed. And this attracted so much attention that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who of course is remembered today as being the author of the Sherlock Holmes series of stories, he was also a spiritualist. He became obsessed with these images and was promoting them as fact. He believed that these were definitive proof that fairies existed, and for many years was writing books on this and commenting on this. Years later, I think it was like the 1960s, one of the cousins finally admitted, no, he faked the whole thing. And of course, if you look at this image, it looks obviously fake. But again, it attracted so much attention because it was so interesting, so odd, so novel. You can kind of understand why so much strange content on the internet resonates today. And that takes us, of course, to the operation of photo montage. As time goes on, darkroom manipulators get better and better at their craft, and they're very easily able to stitch together elements from different photographs. And most of their output, right, is very creative, right, very exaggerated. For instance, there's many postcards from like the late 19th, early 20th century that exist that kind of highlight and overemphasize the different products that were available in regions in the United States. For instance, the giant corn one could enjoy in Wisconsin, or the giant fish, right, one could pull out of the local lake. And, of course, nobody really believed this, but again, they were so whimsical, they were so interesting, just like memes are today. People traded these things, right? They sought after them. When they were, visiting a different place, they would try to find these postcards. And to this day, these things remain very collectible. Finally, here's my favorite one, old spirit photography. In the late 19th century, a photographer realized that there's a really interesting trick you can play by exposing film multiple times. So the first time you expose the film, you get a reasonably high quality image for the time anyway. If you expose the film again and you add another object, that object appears now on the picture when you develop it. But it's a lower quality image. And so you get these ghost-like apparitions. And so this became another effect people were really interested in buying when they were sitting for portraits, because they would bring a picture of their deceased relative, for instance, a deceased wife, a deceased child, and then, right, you could sit for a portrait with the ghost. This became known as old spirit photography. And this idea really never goes away, right? As soon as the digital camera is invented, photographers realize, hey, we have all these cool effects. What if we update them to the digital realm? And what if we go beyond them? In 1988, Gerard Holtzman, who was an engineer working at Bell Labs, publishes a book called Beyond Photography. I really recommend this one as well if you're interested in the history of photographic manipulation, because it's really a catalog of some of the earliest techniques that were available. Holtzman basically goes and re-implements a bunch of things that were well known in film photography, right? Like blurring for retouching, image splicing, right? Back to photomontage. But then he invents a whole bunch of other interesting transforms, which you could not do in the darkroom, right? Complicated nonlinear transforms like head shrinking, artistic stylization, which, if you're into generative models today, that's really, really popular and really fun. Corporate logoization, like turn your friend into the AT&T Death Star logo. Of course, he worked for the phone company at Bell Labs. This is a really interesting book too. If you're interested in the history of computing, because a lot of the subjects, right, that he is taking photos of and then manipulating are really famous Bell Labs people, like old Unix people. Like I think that's Rob Pike in the Viking helmet there. Like Ken Thompson's in this, right? A lot of interesting people, Dennis Ritchie. And he also produced like a software package. It was a command line software package that would, right, of course, add these effects, but that wasn't that user friendly. At the same exact time, you have two brothers in Michigan, Tom and John Knoll, who are developing Photoshop, right? So they know that you can do these things on a computer. They were really interested in photography. In fact, Tom Knoll was working on a PhD at the time on digital imaging with our good friend Ed Delp at Purdue. Delp at that time was in Michigan as a professor at the University of Michigan. And Delp really had no idea that Tom was sort of, in his after hours, developing what would become the most famous image editing software of all time and one of the most famous software packages of all time, Adobe Photoshop. The Knoll brothers really, again, they knew the power of these tools, but they wanted to make it so accessible that anybody could do this at home, right, with their PC, right, something like, a Mac, which was already very user-friendly. And they're also really interested in pushing the boundaries, like color photography, high resolution photography, make sure that this works with this program. There were a lot of ad hoc tools that photographers were using, but they really like put all these things together. They also make this genius move to add a plugin facility to Photoshop. So if you really had a new idea, you could create your own filter and insert it directly into the software. You didn't have to go through a software company to make that happen. And that's really why I think Photoshop took off compared to many of its competitors. This is series of images that came from the early demo of Photoshop. So John Knoll was working at Industrial Light and Magic. He knew a lot about special effects. He also knew how to sell products. And so he created what he thought was like the most spectacular demo of all time. This is a photo of his wife, Jennifer, when they were, I think, on their honeymoon in Bali, right? In sort of like the South Pacific. And of course, right, she's topless, and he's like, what would be amazing for a demo? Let me clone her. Let me clone beauty is how he would describe this. And of course, at that time, right, like tech executives are all male, right? There's kind of this like fraternity, sort of aspect to all of this, right? This like juvenile stuff. But this demo really resonates, and Adobe is basically like sold. We're going to buy the whole thing. And of course, right, they retain the rights to this software to this day. Jennifer, looking back in more recent interviews, is actually still upbeat about this whole demo. She thinks it's great. And it really did, so she says, right, highlight, right, the real power of these creative tools, right? They really can manipulate beauty in a plausible way, and also really fantastic ways, right? Again, sort of like cloning an individual. Text overlay editing, you can do all sorts of really like plausible changes now to images as you get into the late 1990s. This would be something that's really consequential for memes, the deletion of objects, right? Just as the Chinese censors are deleting figures from photographs, right? This becomes easier and far more plausible when we get into the digital realm. These are some results from Hani Farid's lab when he was at Dartmouth. Some of you are probably familiar with this work. And then really sort of trying to make it, as believable as possible. It's like, what kind of adversarial manipulations can you add into the frequency domain, right? Because of course, now you're starting to think about this in a forensics context. Face swapping gets a lot better, right? By the time we get to the early 2000s, innovations in computer graphics allow us to do this in a far more plausible manner. And then you finally get to memes, right, in the early 2000s, right? Like what we would at least consider to be like a contemporary, like internet meme. This is a really interesting one because it's generally acknowledged to be like the first really successful image-based meme. Yes, this is a manipulated photograph. This is the famous 9/11 tourist guy photo. It appears to show a man at the top of one of the World Trade Center towers moments before one of the planes barrels into it and destroys it. And this was circulating, this is before social media, so it was circulating via email, and a little story was attached to it, just like Bayard's photograph in the 19th century. And the story talked about Where did, the provenance of this image? Because the first thing when you sort of see this image, you're like, wait a minute, like if the Trade Center was destroyed, where did this come from, right? Like, this man we presume is dead. And so the story tells a tale about how a first responder is digging through the rubble, trying to find survivors, recovers the camera in the rubble, and decides to develop the photos, and this one comes out, right? And it's this like shocking final moment of the Trade Center towers. And this, of course, led to intense speculation on the internet. Is this real? Is this a hoax? And the internet sort of didn't really care about the answer to that because the image was so intriguing. They were remixing it right away. So again, you see these early remixes where the 9/11 tourist sky is being inserted into other famous disasters, both real and imagined, like the Challenger space shuttle explosion and this attack on New York by King Kong. Finally, after a couple months pass, the guy who's in the photo comes forward and says, hey, I'm still alive, and I just used Photoshop to make this, right? And he sort of resolves the controversy. Sort of. There was still controversy after this because, a lot of people were discussing the ethics of this, right? Was this the right thing to do? Some people said, this is, definitely a hoax, right? It's distracting people from a very serious problem. The 9/11 attack on the United States. Other people were saying, there has always been dark humor when bad things have happened in world history. This is nothing new. And this is one way people cope with a very serious circumstance, right? Through humor. And so that brings us to the frontier of the imagination. So as I mentioned, I think the internet is misunderstood. And that's why we have, right, so many controversies related to the fake content that exists there. The internet, I think in a lot of people's minds is this 1990s vision of the internet, the information superhighway, right? So this is when the internet starts to become very popular. You have corporations moving into this infrastructure, which had been originally developed for military applications, or so we were told. And they have this really bland idea of what the internet is, right? It's going to be a database of facts. We'll go there to look things up for work and for education. And that's basically it, right? And so you see advertising from this era, for instance, from IBM, saying things like, wander through a distant library, turn your corner store into a multinational. Curious? IBM can get you there, right? So it's very emblematic of this very bland internet, right? But that's not why the internet became popular. The internet became popular because it's this creative space that anybody can participate in. There were so many interesting pieces of software like Photoshop, or right, like generative AI today, that allow us to project our imaginations into that infrastructure and share our imaginations with other people. And that actually is the internet that was constructed based on the ideas of one Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan is a very famous media theorist who is associated with the counterculture in the 1960s. He's a professor at the University of Toronto. And he writes like he's a character in a movie. He says these like very like startling and profound things about the media. And in the 60s, he describes what he believes to be the information network of the future. And he's really describing the internet. He's saying this will be a place composed of electric circuitry that will be an extension of the central nervous system. So again, your imagination will be sent to other people. It's going to unite the globe because everybody on the planet will be hooked into this information network. And he kind of gives this challenge then to engineers to build this infrastructure. And that's exactly what happens. You have, again, these kind of like hippie-like engineers at Bell Labs, like the people who brought us the Unix operating system. They're really interested in this idea. Wouldn't it be interesting if we had multi-user systems where people could sort of form a global village? What if we built creative tools like image editing software to help people do things you can't do in the physical world in this new virtual space? Wired magazine dubs McLuhan the patron saint of the internet in their inaugural issue from the early 1990s. And again, it sort of becomes another charge for a different generation of computer scientists to build this infrastructure to even more elaborate heights. And so that's the dilemma, I think, when we think about fake stuff, right? The internet's awash in fake stuff because it was designed to facilitate that, right? It was designed for storytelling. But a lot of people have sort of misunderstood that role, right? They go to the internet looking for the facts, right? But they're not really finding as many facts as fictions. And a lot of the proto-social media that develops, again, is embodying these ideas. For instance, right, something awful really propels the image-based meme in the early 2000s, right? Parodying basically everything, right, from politics to pop culture. updated today, you find like Reddit's Photoshop battles, subreddit doing the same thing, right? It's like, again, remixing content over and over and over. How creative can you get? What's like the most interesting stylized representation of something? And that really then leads to like, the real bleeding edge of all this, which is generative art. Now we have really interesting neural networks that can do things like restyle images, right? For instance, you could take your favorite old master painting, for instance, Girl with Pearl Earring, and restyle it in the mode of your favorite animated series, for instance, Netflix Arcane series. And you have these fandoms that exist on the internet. So these very large communities of people that are really invested in like a science fiction series, a fantasy book, right? And they're using, right, these tools to keep telling those stories, right? To build on the professionally produced narratives and to keep engagement going within their community. People just love all of this, right? But of course, all of it is fake, but it's fake in a good way. All right, I'm going to stop here, but if you want to learn more, as I mentioned, this is just a one talk adapted from one chapter of this new book, A History of Fake Things on the Internet, which was just released a couple of weeks ago. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it from the publisher, Stanford University Press, or many other booksellers out there on the internet or in the physical world. I am happy to answer any questions folks may have on any of this.
Thanks a
Thank you.
lot, Walter. Very interesting talk. Many of the things that you discuss here, I share the same opinion. And I have some questions for you, some provocations, as you know me. And I would also would like to open the space here for some questions of the audience. We have some 15 minutes for this. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat, and I'll go over as we have time. So Walter, mainly the discussions that you put here is like about the exaggeration the media has around the fakes. And I kind of agree with that because many times we are talking about politicians or very important people. And with these kind of targets, you really have audience. And if you have audience, you have the incentive to publicize that even more, even though the forgeries, the fakes might be not that strong. But then there was a point in your talk that you said that deepfakes don't really work. I guess that you're talking about the deepfakes don't really work in the helmet of politics, right? Because if you look at the 85% of deepfakes, you're talking about porn deepfake, and they really work. They go against the public view of that particular person. We have several cases of like actors and actresses suing other parties and trying to recover that image, that public, their public image. So, what do you have to say about deepfakes that are related to porn, to child porn, more recently, or even to audio attacks that we have been seeing in WhatsApp and message systems that people fall prey to this kind of
Yeah. These are all good questions. Yeah, let me clarify. It's not that I'm saying fakes don't work at all. It's just the types of fakes you think will work don't, and the ones you don't think will work do. Right. So I was just trying to, for some reason, I can't reshare my screen. I'm not sure what happened. Oh, wait, here. I think this is the issue. Let me try this again to make a point. Oh, sorry. Okay. Oops, I think this is back. Let's represent. Yeah, let me just go all the way back to the beginning. Right, so if you want to be good at faking things in politics and have those messages be received really well by an audience, right? Like, and again, like Trump, of course, is really good at producing this content. Also in Brazil, right? Jair Bolsonaro, very good at producing this content. You make sensational, obviously over the top, fake looking stuff. Because that is what people like to look at. That is what they like to trade. They also like making these images themselves, right? So there's a community participation aspect to this, which you don't get with like a very plausible fake, right? You know, is this like, it's like, how are you going to remix this thing, which is just like a bland scene, right? There's nothing really interesting about it, right? It's like it's the meme type content that works so spectacularly well. What doesn't work again is the really plausible deep fake like stuff, right? For years now, because again, deep fakes show up in 2017. We've been hearing, you know, this is it, you know, this is the end of truth, you know, as we know it. But they've had, as far as anybody can tell, no effect at all, right? It's because of the easy way we can debunk them, as I pointed out, right? You know, if there's so much information to the contrary, like it's easily dismissed right away. But you make a good point about where we've seen these things become problematic is in the realm of pornography. That I would agree with. That said, it's successful for the same reason these other meme-like manipulations are successful. It's obviously fake, right? The intent isn't to fool somebody that this famous actress recorded pornography, because again, nobody's going to believe that. It's really meant to sort of like either humiliate that person or right to satisfy some kind of like, you know, sick fantasy, but that doesn't matter, right? Because right, the content is just like fitting into that narrative, right? So whoever created it, it has no intent to fool anybody, right? It's just to achieve one of these other objectives. In most cases too, like the deep fake pornography is obviously fake, right? It's not good, it's not plausible, right? In terms of being like a photorealistic video. It's just bad. But again, that works just like these other things work.
So according to your view, if you really want to do something in the political realm, mimify it.
Exactly. And again, politicians know this. Like savvy politicians are doing this, right? Like Donald Trump does this, Jair Bolsonaro does this. You know, we see this across the globe, right? You know, and again, politicians all the way down the chain are doing this because they know it works, right? They have professional like PR operations that obviously like recognize that this is effective.
And how do
This
you
is the way
see
this works.
how do you see that we could fight back? Because in my opinion, even if it's a meme, it can affect the public view of a person, and that can resonate with a particular fraction of the public, and that might be bad politically speaking for candidates, for instance.
Yeah. And so the question is like, what exactly are we fighting, right? So historically in politics, parody and satire have been a staple, right? It's like politicians have been doing this since the dawn of politics, right? Even the mainstream press, right? If you think about this kind of political humor in the past, it was in the form of like editorial cartoons that all major newspapers would run. Now those things have become more controversial these days, but this is kind of like the modern version of this. So on the one hand, this may be perfectly fine and healthy for a democracy. On the other hand, some of these messages are not great, right? And they may be designed to deceive somebody. So then the question is, what are you using as a source of news, right? Should it be memes? Probably not, right? There are other more trustworthy news sources, again, more traditional media. That's probably where you want to look if you were trying to get to the facts. But in my book, I point out even the mainstream media has problems with faking stuff. If you buy the book, you'll see the second chapter has a spectacular story on a major news organization reporting about UFOs. So stay tuned for that. But again, like usually again, if it's real, there's a consensus building across different news organizations, right? So you probably want to look at a number of different, you know, newspapers, magazines, radio stations, TV stations, right? More conventional, older forms of media. And you know, what is the government saying? What are trustworthy sources saying, right? Versus what's in the memes, right? Because again, if you go into the internet understanding that memes are parody and satire, you probably won't take, you know, violent action based on them or self-destructive action based on them.
So now I would like to take this one level up. So when you look at specific objects that are created or falsified, in the big scheme of things, you can easily say that, yeah, it's fake because there are no other aspects of the context that corroborate that particular story. But more recently, we have this appearance of something called synthetic realities, which basically brings the generated object plus a context, plus a narrative. So now you with this generative AI and all of this AI to help you create things, you not only create a particular video, not we are not there yet with videos, but you do not create simply an image, to illustrate something. You can create the whole context. You can create the whole narrative. And
Yeah,
then when
an
you put
environment.
online, it's going to be the context, it's going to be the narrative, it's going to be the object. How do you see these complicating in the future?
I'm not sure if it complicates anything. I mean, I feel like this is a very attractive idea in the technology world. This is the metaverse, is basically what you're describing, right? So it's like you could have like many metaverses, right, that are very immersive. I think this is perfectly consistent with McLuhan's vision of what the internet would become. And I think people actually want to be in those virtual spaces for good reasons, right? Not for reasons of deception or like, like malicious intent for the most part. And I don't know, again, like, is that really a forensics question? Probably not, right? Because we have things like this already, like video games, for instance, or immersive environments, right? With all of those elements. And they're becoming more complicated, right? Especially as more developers are using generative AI, right? To sort of build out the world in a richer fashion.
I'm talking even before the metaverse. I'm talking about our reality when a person, instead of just creating like a fake of Biden here, starts to creating the whole narrative around it. So you can create the image and then you can create the story behind it, and you start like putting some small pieces of that story online, and then you can create the ground to receive the whole story. So it's like when you synthesize a new reality. So how do you see
But again,
this?
that's not, I mean, it's just an alternate reality, right? I mean, that's been explored, like fiction has done that, like novels have done that, right? For hundreds of years. I don't think that's like really any different than any other storytelling, except right, it's a richer virtual environment. And again, like something like McLuhan would be quite upbeat about. And again, if you don't go to that virtual environment expecting this to be a factual representation of the physical world, it's probably fine.
And how do you see when we have these fakes, for instance, in science? Because we
Yes,
have
that's one. Yeah, this
many.
is a good question. That's one case I feel like there's like zero tolerance, right? Because like that's just not science, right? I mean, I think this is a huge problem. I mean, it's just academic misconduct, right? I don't there's no valid reason to do that, right, in the scientific literature. Um, so again, I think again because it's appearing in a very sensitive context that is like meant to be serious and factual, right? Politics has always had some element of like fiction to it, right? Even politicians we trust, right, are storytellers, right? They're always like really good storytellers. But that's like quite different, right? And the outcomes are different depending on who's paying attention than like something in like a serious scientific journal, right? And again, like very famous scientists have fallen into this trap, right? I mean, I think there is a too much pressure to publish, right? And there are bad incentives, especially for early career researchers, to fake their results. And that just again leads to like bad outcomes, right? Because people waste time trying to like follow these experimental protocols, right? These assays, and like nothing comes of it, right? Because it's fake. Right? Like there could be poor health outcomes, right? If it's in the medical literature. So again, I think it's really like what is the context the fake stuff is appearing in, right?
And what do you see as the main challenges in this area going forward? As you said, we have these memes for the political satire or jokes, but it seems that we have more and more of them, and it seems that people believe them more and more. We have the case of that election that I was there with you, of the children in a pizza place.
Oh yeah, the pizza
And
gate. Yeah,
actually,
yeah, yeah.
the pizza gate, and we had like actually people that went there to see if it was true. So even though if it's a meme, people believe it. But I see that with the emergence of like better algorithms to facilitate the creations of this stuff, these might go out of control. So what do you think as the next steps in terms of complications and the countermeasures?
Yeah, I think the internet is bad at in-group out-group signaling. So again, like in many cases, you have stories that are being told for the purposes of parody and satire, but somebody misunderstands that material, right? And again, I think like the Pizzagate thing is like one of those cases, right? It's like an obviously ridiculous story. But somebody misunderstands this, right? And actually goes there with an assault rifle and shoots the place up. the internet is really bad at like correcting people. When they see people are like believing it, they kind of like egg them on, right? They think it's funny. They want them to believe even more, even though the community producing this content knows that it's fake, right? That I feel is like an ethical lapse. And there is a lot. So yeah, the reach of this, right, is much different, right? Because people are creating this content themselves, right? And there's just again like so much of it out there. I think again, like if we could maybe just educate users, about the internet, where it's like, hey, like this is the internet, right? This is not the physical world, and like you shouldn't go into this, believing, things like right off the bat. There is some serious stuff on the internet, but it's sort of drowned out by all of the fictions. But the fictions are what people love, right? And that's why they're going there. And again, I think most reasonable people know this, right? This is like not a surprising observation. But again, there's a handful of people you have to worry about. And again, I think the internet's just not good at sort of, correcting the behavior of those people when a problem is apparent. Right. I think
One
we've
of
all
the
sort of seen
last
this on social media, right? At some point.
one of the last things that you mentioned, and just to finalize here, you mentioned that most reasonable people would spot it, and that we need some technological literacy to go and debunk these kind of things. But the problem is, most of the people around the world, they are not tech savvy, and we don't have that level of technological literacy for these people. So
Yeah, I
it
don't,
seems that we
yeah.
have some challenges that will go beyond our works as scientists, because for you and me and people in this audience that work with tech, yeah, we could quickly spot it. But how about the average citizen?
But I think I want to give people some credit. Like I don't think it's a matter of technological literacy, right? I mean, I think people understand this content like a lot better than like the media thinks that they understand it, right? Again, like people are pretty savvy. Like people like again aren't just looking at these things in isolation and believing them, right? They know the social context, right? They know like what they're supposed to get out of this, and they sort of know what they're excited about. I don't think you need to like teach them about the technology, like image editing technology. Like I think it's really about like is it virtuous to like spread this content, right? Is this the message like you want your kids to see, right? Like there's some basic like social questions that need to be asked. Like that I think is far more helpful. And again, since so much of this stuff is obviously edited, like it's sort of like, beside the point to like talk about the technical aspects of image manipulation.
Very good. I have a question here to finish it from
Mhm.
Tanushree. Thank you for your enlightening talk in line with the question that I did about synthetic realities. She is curious to know, these days with generative AI in all sectors, it's very easy and accessible when you want to write a professional looking fake news article by tools like ChatGPT and generate supporting images with tools like DALL-E and Midjourney. What's your thought on this? How such fake news propagation will affect society, or how to stop it? Just to
Yeah, I mean,
conclude, Walter.
yeah, it's a good question too, right? Because we didn't really talk about like text synthesis here, but my same message applies to that, and the book touches on this a little bit as well. I see tools like ChatGPT being like creative tools. Again, like they produce text that's like interesting. It's good for storytelling. It's not great for facts, right? I think all of us have had that experience of right the tool hallucinating, right? For instance, like if I ask for like a bibliography for myself, right, I get back like half the papers are real, half are like these word salad titles that don't exist. And again, if you sort of know that, like it's fine. I don't think it really changes much because again, it's just more sort of like content out there on the internet, right? I don't think any one fake news story from ChatGPT is actually going to resonate. I mean, the other thing too with the fake, auto-generated fake content like that, it's not appearing in the New York Times, right? It's not appearing in like a prominent place. It's just like, circulating on social media, and it has to compete against everything else circulating on social media, most of which is also fake, right? So it just doesn't really move the needle. And again, all that stuff, as I pointed out, is so easily debunked, right? And again, people are doing this all of the time. That I just don't see that as being a serious concern, even though again we hear about it all the time. That's just not what I worry about on a regular basis.
All right. Thanks a lot again for your presentation. Thanks to everyone in the audience. I would like to let you know that this talk was recorded and we are going to put it on YouTube in our channel later on. And if you're curious to see this and more, I totally recommend Walter's latest book. You can get it from Amazon and other sources. Walter, once again, thanks a lot. And
yeah, thank you so
safe.
much again. Yeah, hopefully this was an optimistic talk, right?
Yeah, you are very optimistic about the future. I'm a little bit more skeptical about it, but I understand your points. Thanks a lot.
All right, thanks everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care. Happy holidays.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.